All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I will try to work on making sure everybody stays on mute as we go through the presentation. And then Dr. Zvacek, I'll let you kind of determine how you want to do questions. But first, I would like to welcome everybody to our fifth Roy Browning Senior Faculty Development Symposium series, which say that 5 times in a row. Titled Digital Natives and Other Mythical Beasts. But before I introduce our speaker, I would like to first highlight the Browning Symposium, which was started 3 years ago in response to a very generous gift given in honor of Roy W. Browning Sr., who was a distinguished and renowned educator in the state of Kansas. The symposium continues today as we remember Roy's heart and dedication to student scholarships and faculty development to enhance teaching and learning. Our series today is led by Dr. Susan Zvacek. Dr. Zvacek is an educational consultant, teacher, and speaker focused on learning-centered higher education. Her disciplinary interests include learning theory, distance education, and instructional design. Susan's background as a faculty member and university administrator prepared her well for this second career, which has been heavily influenced by irreverence, skepticism, and curiosity. She has had 2 Fulbright appointments and has spoken at events in Costa Rica, Estonia, Slovakia, Germany, China, Austria, Cyprus, and throughout the US. These experiences have confirmed her suspicions that at their best, humans are illogical, smart, hilarious, and kind. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Zvacek. I do want to say there will be a survey that I'm going to post in the chat towards the end of the symposium series. But until then, Dr. Zvacek, you are leading the way.
Okay, thank you so much, Andrea. And I think what might work best would be for us to hold questions until the end, although it would probably make sense if you have a question, maybe go ahead and put it into chat so you don't forget. But I think we could address those at the end because I may answer your questions as I go along. So, as I'm talking about something, you may find that I address your question. So today I want to talk about some popular myths in teaching and learning. And the one I'll spend the most time on is the myth of the digital native. But I'll talk about a few others as well. But I want to start off talking about this idea of the digital native. And let me jump here. There we go. So this idea of that our students were sort of magically tech savvy because they grew up surrounded by computers was really sort of started by a man named Mark Prensky. And in 2001, he wrote an article and used that term, digital native, and said, that these young people, and keep in mind this was 2001, that because they were surrounded by technology, they think and process information fundamentally differently from their processors. Well, in fact, or their predecessors rather. In fact, that's not true. I mean, we're talking about change on an evolutionary scale if they were going to be doing that. And then in a later article, he said they're native speakers of technology, fluent in the digital language of computers, video games, and the internet. Well, in fact, that's not true either. And the sad thing is that Prensky's ideas gained a lot of adherents. There were a lot of people making decisions based on what he had said and had written, when in fact it was based on no research at all. These ideas were really sort of his opinions and based on a little bit of observation of young people that he had observed working with computers. Now, he's not alone. There was also another writer. This one is named Don Tapscott, and he wrote the book Growing Up Digital, which you might be familiar with. But he also had a couple of very interesting things to say, where he said, today's youth are more curious, self-reliant, contrarian, high in self-esteem, global in orientation. Um, well, I have to say that, yeah, this was not based on any research either. And I love that he says compared to their parents, today's youth are more contrarian. Honestly, I think that's just the definition of a teenager, and probably, you know, that's been the case. Everyone thinks that their children are more contrarian than they ever could have possibly been. Um, and he, instead of using the term net geners, he said the net generation. And this idea, I think, is just as damaging as Prensky's ideas of young people having these sort of amazing technological powers. But he said they know to be skeptical and to scrutinize the information they see online. And yeah, that's a no in both cases. So I want to talk just a bit about, what the reality is and what we've seen in terms of research, certainly since the early 2000s when they were making these claims. So first of all, there's no evidence of any generational difference as far as technology skills. I mean, how many times have you heard people say, oh, my microwave is blinking 12. I need to have a 5-year-old come in and fix that. Well, in fact, there's really no difference generationally. And the truth is that the vast majority of people who use computers do some fairly basic things. They're simply not, as a group, engaging in a lot of complex programming. They might be playing games, but a very small percentage is actually creating games. And so this idea that these digital natives just were, so heavily engaged in technology and able to do so many things was in fact not borne out by research. And if you want to see this in your own students, one thing you might do is, ask them to write a paper using something like Microsoft Word and tell them you want them to have the pages automatically numbered. This is a pretty basic thing to do in Microsoft Word, but I've seen this really throw a lot of people. And not only that they didn't know how to do it, which, okay, you look that up, but they weren't sure where to find that information about how to do that. So what's interesting is that when we dig into the research about these digital literacy skills, the majority of it relies on self-report. So, someone asks people, are you good with technology? Well, you know, we if we believe that we're one of these digital natives, then yes, we're probably much more likely to say, yes, I know how to do a lot of things. And this sort of comes back to that idea of the Dunning-Kruger effect, where, the less we know about something, the more confident we're likely to be about that knowledge, mainly because we don't even know enough to know how little we know. And so when we look at this research that relies on, self-reporting, the results can be highly skewed by that effect. Now, what's interesting over the last year and a half is that as so many courses, so many campuses moved to online instruction because of the pandemic, that really made it clear that it's not as though we can slap a label on a whole generational group to say, wow, they're really great at technology. What it made obvious to us is that there's a huge variability in technology skills. You have that small percentage, up at the top, sort of, it's probably comes out to be like a bell curve, right? Up at the top, you've got this small percentage of people who are doing these amazing things with technology. At the other end, you've got folks who are, might be termed laggards if you look at the adoption and diffusion of innovations research, but that most people are in the middle. Kind of average, some skills, know some things, maybe not others. Um, but as we moved things online, it became really obvious that there was a huge variability and that we couldn't simply ignore that, or that we couldn't make assumptions about our students, in fact, having these amazing skills. Now, one thing that's nice is that we're starting to see more articles in the popular press and a variety of, sort of more popular periodicals debunking this idea. So, the digital native is a myth. There aren't any. Digital natives are no better at technology than we are. And so, we're starting to see that, in fact, this myth is something that we need to let go of. So, oops, my computer doesn't want to advance. There we go. So, yeah, why does this even matter? I mean, okay, they think they're really good at technology, or maybe I assume that my students are really good. Well, there are some big time downsides to this. One of these is that if administrators at colleges or in K-12 systems believe in this myth, they may in fact make policy decisions based on this. And I like this quote from Sadowski, where he says, when you focus on this small group of people, that ed tech decisions really get made, which, as he said, line the pockets of ed tech consultants. And I have to say, the first time I read that, I was like, oh, I'm an ed tech consultant. But I wasn't getting my pockets lined, unfortunately. But in the process, what can happen is that decisions related to data security and privacy, there might be this assumption that, they'll take care of themselves. Our students, they're digital natives. They know how to take care of themselves. They know how to protect their information. And so there might be decisions made that maybe we can play down the need for this. And maybe we can even reduce the amount of sort of like help sessions, or the amount of tech support that we need at a university, or let's reduce the number of workshops we have, because our students know how to do these things. Many of you might remember Second Life, right? Second Life is a really good example of a technology that a lot of money was spent on in the, what would it have been, like 2000s, in the early, 2000 to 2000, 8, 10. A lot of schools spent a lot of money on that. And that sort of virtual world application, in fact, would rely on students being fairly technologically adept. And what happened was the professors who decided they were going to teach, political science using Second Life, or they were going to teach poetry about Second Life, or history, what they often discovered was that the students spent so much time trying to figure out how to work Second Life and make their avatar learn how to walk, or how they would dress it in different clothes, and that by the time they actually got to the course content, they'd lost a lot of time simply learning how to use the program. So, those kinds of decisions where university administrators got very excited about, a technology application like that. And in fact, that was a great application for students who were specifically learning how to, create virtual worlds. You had these computer science students who were learning about creating games and virtual environments. That was good for them. The rest of the students, not so much. Now, on the other side of that, if students believe this myth about themselves, what we've learned from research is they're less likely to seek help, and they're less likely to be skeptical about the things they learn online. Now, that might seem kind of contradictory, right? But if you think about that, and again, getting back to this idea of sort of being overconfident in what we know and can do, those young computer users who believe that, in fact, yes, I'm a digital native, are going to have that perspective of, I have this, I've got this, I can do this, I don't need help, and I know what I'm doing. So if you look at that little graph I have there, so the self-assessed tech skills, let's see if I can, there we go. So the self-assessed tech skills, if that's really high, look at how low their skepticism and help-seeking behavior is. Okay, so that's been some very interesting research really in about the last 8 or so years that has borne this out, that this, again, the self-report, of students who are saying, yep, I'm really great with technology. What we're finding is that they are less skeptical and less likely to seek help with technology questions. So this is a serious problem. Now, I will say that just a couple days ago, a group called, and I want to make sure I get this right, the Foundation for Privacy released a report. I want to say it was 2 or 3 days ago, which was really an amalgamation of research from the last 5 or so years. And they reported happily that, in fact, students, our university students, are as a group getting better about, being concerned about data privacy and security of their information. Unfortunately, those numbers were pretty low before. And so, yes, it's great that they went up. But in fact, what we're still seeing is that they're nowhere near what we would really like those numbers to be. So having talked about that, I'm going to jump into some other popular myths, some other beasts. And these will include the idea of multitasking, being able to do multiple things at once, the idea of learning styles, and finally, what is often called the learning pyramid. So let's jump into multitasking. Now, there's been a lot of research to debunk the idea of multitasking and its value. And really, what multitasking is simply the appearance of doing 2 or more things at the same time. In fact, we're really not doing 2 things at the same time. What we are doing is we're switching back and forth. So I work on A, then I work on B, then I work on A. So we're basically task, or what we'd say context switching. Now, when we say that, people will always say, well, I sing along with the radio while I'm driving. I'm doing 2 things. Except that what multitasking refers to is tasks that require concentration, or that we require some kind of mental effort. And so what in fact we see is, yes, you can drive and sing along with the radio, but when you drive into a blizzard, you're probably going to be better off turning off the radio, because what you're doing is you're overloading your cognitive processing ability when you have multiple stimuli like that. So all of a sudden now driving takes a lot more attention, it takes a lot more concentration, and to have that other stimuli even in the background, can be distracting and can add to what's called your cognitive load. So, we have a finite amount of energy that we can put toward that sort of manipulation of information and stimuli. And so when we are trying to do things that require our attention, that require us to really focus, what multitasking does is that it makes it more difficult to do both of those things. So why this matters for our students, one of the things is that it causes anxiety. And, we can see this in terms of my example of sort of driving in a blizzard and, listening to the radio or having someone talking to us. Okay, that causes your anxiety level to go up, not only because you're worried about your safety, but because you only have so much processing ability. So, not surprisingly, then, what multitasking does is it interferes with what you're trying to do. So that processing, it interferes with the processing activity that's going on in your working memory. This, in result, ends up in you making more mistakes. Now, you know, what we might say is, well, but if I'm doing A and then I switch to B, well, I can see where I'm not spending as much time on each one. But in fact, what's going on is that you don't actually make a clean cut. In other words, I'm working on A and now I'm going to switch to B, except I can't really turn off A that easily. So there's this sort of latency effect where, my brain is going to sort of keep working on A a little bit while I've switched to B, and the same thing switching back from B to A. So that latency of processing activity is going to actually interfere with the other task. And of course, just the act of switching back and forth takes time. And so what you're actually doing is it's taking you longer to do those tasks, rather than if you had worked on A and completed it and then worked on B. Now, the research has shown pretty clearly that multitasking negatively affects study habits, learning, grades, and GPA. And certainly that's not a complete list. So it's really important that we discourage the use of multitasking among our students and help them recognize that, in fact, this is not something that you want to do, and this is not a behavior that we should think is, oh, this is great, I'm great at multitasking. I've actually had students say to me, I'm really good at multitasking. Well, the reality is, no, you're not, because humans as a group are not good at this. And so this is something we need to actively discourage in our students. Okay, I'm going to talk next about a mythical beast that really has some legs. I mean, this has been around for a very long time. And of all of the myths that I talk about, this is the one I'm most likely to hear from people that, no, I know you're wrong about this. So this is the idea of learning styles. Now, people who suggest that we need to know about our students' learning styles argue that whatever your preference is, so you'll say, I'm a visual learner, meaning that, I really prefer visual stimuli when I'm trying to learn something. Well, these, people who are proponents of this idea would argue that being a particular or having a particular style, like a visual learning style, influences how that person perceives information, how they understand it, how they store it, how they manipulate it, all the parts of the learning process. So when I think about this, the one thing that makes sense to me is that it's a way for us to sort of recognize that, in fact, our students are not all alike, and that our students, in fact, do have variable talents. And, some students seem to be just naturally good at some things and other students, other things. So it's kind of a way to recognize that, but it can be really damaging. So, why this matters. You might say, well, what difference does it make if, you know, I believe that my students are all visual learners, or my students believe that they're visual learners? Well, first of all, just to reiterate, there's no evidence that these styles exist, and in fact, there are no instruments to measure this that have been validated, or that are reliable. You know, they're really inconsistent. You can take the test one time and get a particular answer. You can take it another time and find out you're a completely different style. And there's no evidence that matching instruction to a student's preferred medium improves learning, or that a mismatch makes learning more difficult. My biggest concern with this idea is that ultimately what we are doing is labeling our students. Oh, you're you're a visual learner. And I don't know that we should be doing that. And I don't think we should encourage them to label themselves. Now, I'm sure you've heard about the ideas of having a growth mindset. We want all our students to have a growth mindset, right? And to really acknowledge that they are capable of learning in a whole bunch of ways. They are capable of learning from a variety of stimuli, and that, in fact, um, they don't have to feel limited. Now, when we talk about a growth mindset, we might say, if a student would say to me, well, I didn't do very well on that algebra test because I'm just not a math person. Okay, that's not a growth mindset. Okay, because what you're doing at that point is saying, well, I'm limited. I've labeled myself as not a math person, when in fact, you can probably learn math about as well as anybody else. And the same thing with, oh, I didn't do well in that foreign language class because I'm just not an auditory learner. Well, in fact, you probably could do well in foreign language classes, but you need to change your study skills. Or maybe you just need to study right from the get-go. Okay, so this idea that we can blame our struggles on some kind of, oh, well, I'm just not a whatever kind of learner, that in fact, there's really no evidence of that. And what we're doing is we're promoting this idea that our students are limited in how they can learn, when in fact, what we need to see is a change in their behavior, and possibly a change in our teaching strategies. Maybe it's not that we need to match their preference for them to learn foreign languages better, but that in fact, we need to do a better job of identifying effective strategies in the first place. Now, I think what's helpful is to think about this idea for ourselves. For example, I hate to watch videos to learn anything. I know some people love that, but if I'm looking online to find like information about how to learn something new, and I see, oh, there's all these YouTube videos, that's the last thing I will go, I will go look at. But that doesn't mean that I can't learn from that. And I have to acknowledge for myself that even though I don't like to watch videos to learn something, in many cases, that's the best way for me to learn it. So I need to let go of that idea to say, well, I don't prefer this, but many times that's what I should be doing, is watching videos, because that's the most appropriate kind of strategy for me to learn this. And so really acknowledging that, in fact, yes, we can learn from a variety of stimuli, and that we don't want to put those limitations on ourselves or our students. So the third myth that I'm going to talk about, and this really is a beast. This is a very long-lived beast. It has been around for many, many, many decades. And this is what is sort of oddly known as the learning pyramid. You will see this all over the place. Usually they give credit to what's this place called the National Training Laboratories in Maine. The National Training Laboratories, in fact, has gone on record saying they stand behind these percentages and this this pyramid, but the original research has been lost. Huh? Wow. Make of that what you will, I guess. There's so many things wrong with this. It's really tough to unbundle it. So let's start with the idea of the percentages in the first place. I don't know about you, but I haven't seen much research where the percentages break out this neatly. Look at that, 5, 10, 20, 30, and then 50, 75, 90. Even if these were rounded, it's highly unlikely they would have come out this neatly. The other thing is that these categories are kind of nonsensical. So what we're looking at here is lecture, which is a passive activity. And then we jump to reading, which is only 10%. But in fact, reading is less passive. But then we jump back down to audiovisual. Now, keep in mind that this pyramid is so old that audiovisual really just referred to things like watching a video or looking at pictures, which in fact, now we're back to things that are very passive, like with lecture. And then we go to demonstration, which in this case refers to watching a demonstration. And that for some reason, watching a live demonstration, that's what this refers to, is somehow better than watching a demonstration on video. I don't know why. Then we have a big jump up if we participate in a discussion, right? So that's more active. That's a good thing. And then practice doing the task and teaching someone else. Now, like I said, there's a lot going on here. Finally, the third thing that I think is suspicious is that what they say is that this is the knowledge retention. Well, I think, that in itself signals that what we're looking at is people being able to retrieve information. Okay, and that's what these subjects were being assessed on, was could they remember things? And I think we need to recognize that, this might not really be the kind of learning we want our students to focus on. So let's talk about why this matters. And I have to say that even as old as this is, and the fact that this has been debunked over and over and over again, I still see this in presentations. I see it in book chapters. I see it in articles. And it does matter, right? Because it suggests the teacher should avoid some kind of instruction, regardless of what you expect your students to be learning. And on the flip side of that, it encourages teachers to use strategies that may in fact be ineffective. So simply having that sort of pat, oh, well, discussion is always better than reading. Well, no, that's not true. I mean, yes, we want our students to be actively engaged, but it's not as though discussion is always better for a given outcome. And then finally, as I mentioned, it really promotes a simplistic idea of the kind of learning we want students to do if what we're looking at is simple retention of information. That I think what most of us would argue is that we really want to go beyond that. So, these these four beasts, the idea of digital natives, the idea of multitasking, learning styles, and this learning pyramid, all of these have been unfortunately long-lived. And, when we think about that, one of the first questions we might ask is, well, why do we believe them? Why do they keep showing up in book chapters? Why do they keep showing up in articles? Why do they keep showing up on websites? Well, the first big reason for that is that, we're not familiar with the research. you know, um, and, if you work in a disciplinary field like the sciences, maybe you're a biologist. Okay, you're a biology teacher. You're probably reading biology research or biology education research. You're not really focused on the research that, in fact, would be debunking this. And so, yeah, I mean, no one would expect you to like be digging into that research. And unfortunately, what happens is that people in the non-education disciplines are writing articles and doing research using these myths. And so we're still seeing, research coming out where, it's like, well, let's see, if students are, multitasking, with this task, if they do better than these other students. You know, we're seeing that in the disciplinary journals. And, it's very frustrating because, again, we don't expect everyone in the disciplines to be familiar with the research, but if you are going to do research, you need to do your homework before that and identify what are good research questions. Now, another reason we believe these myths is that they are intuitively attractive and they're believable. Um, we love this idea that we're able to like categorize ourselves, right? Sort of with the learning styles, right? I can take this online quiz and find out like what kind of potato I am, or, in Facebook, right? I can take a little test where, I click on the pumpkin or the jack-o'-lantern that I like best, and it tells me something about myself. Well, those things are kind of fun and, not really, there's no harm in that particularly. But when we try to reduce these ideas to something so simple, then we sort of run into trouble. Now, over the last 5 years, there's been a lot of research about misinformation and why we are susceptible to misinformation. This idea of misinformation being crafted in a way that is cognitively attractive, I think is really interesting. And there's some great research about this. But what we see is that I can package information in a way that is more likely to make you believe it. And this, we come back to research about, what are we most likely to pay attention to? For example, one of the things that psychologists have discovered is that we're more likely to find information credible if it's framed in a negative way than in a positive way. And that's kind of depressing. That's kind of depressing to learn. But, if we read research that says, 60% of people, hate their jobs, right? We're going to find that more believable than if we read 40% of people love their jobs. Isn't that weird? It's exactly the same information, right? But we're more likely to believe it when we hear it framed negatively. And, there's some interesting sort of work that goes into this that is referred to as cognitive anthropology, which I just think, wow, what a cool area that must be to work in. So what we find is that the ideas appeal to us cognitively. And one of the reasons they appeal to us also is that they provide a simple answer to a complex idea. I think that's one reason people loved that old idea of right brain, left brain, right? That we had, the right brain does this and the left brain does that. And, people are, one or the other, like you're more right brained or you're more left brained. Well, that's been debunked for quite a long time. You still sort of hear it around a little bit, but it's such a clean, elegant way to address something that's extremely complicated that it was really pretty attractive. And what we've since learned, of course, is that there's so much integration between the hemispheres that it doesn't really work to say, oh, well, you're right brain, you're left brain. The research on traumatic brain injuries has shown us that, in fact, different parts of the brain can be recruited to take on tasks that may have been handled on the other hemisphere. And so we really see that the integration, in fact, is so very robust that it's kind of hard to, apply that very pat answer to, how your brain works. And then finally, we're more likely to believe things when it's compatible with what we already believe or something that we've observed. And we certainly see this on social media. We can be fooled pretty easily if someone, promotes an idea and it aligns with what I already think. I always say, tell me the things you believe and I will be able to fool you. Because if you're reading something online or wherever, and you read it and you say, huh, I knew it. Isn't that obvious, right? That's the time you need to double check, because we're most vulnerable to being fooled when information is compatible with what we already believe. And it gets back to this idea of how difficult it is for us, in fact, to address our students' misconceptions. Because if they really believe something and we provide information that disagrees with that, it's actually very difficult to dislodge that existing belief. Okay, so then the question is, how do we conquer these beasts? Well, we need to practice and model for our students and encourage them to be skeptical. We need to model skepticism. We need to ask those questions like, what makes you think that? What kind of information makes you believe that is true? How can I evaluate that information that I'm reading online? And so really sort of questioning and helping students start to ask that questions of themselves. What makes me think that I should believe this? Why do I think this is credible? We also should reward curiosity among our students. For example, when you read something and you think, huh, that's interesting, like dig into that. First of all, just because it might be interesting, but more importantly, because what you might discover is that you were being fooled, you were being deceived. And so, rewarding curiosity among our students, I think, goes a long way to, helping them learn to be skeptical. And then, simply questioning statements or arguments that kind of seem simplistic to us. We get back to that idea of, right brain and left brain. Well, while that's really a kind of neat, elegant way to think about how our brain works, it's awfully simple for something as complicated as a brain, or ideas that seem kind of exaggerated, even if you agree with them. A few years ago, I saw this blurb online saying, researchers have discovered how to upload information directly to your brain. And I thought, wow, really? So which seemed really exaggerated, but it made me curious, so I went back and found the research article that this newspaper had reported on, and there was nothing in there remotely like uploading information to your brain. So, really questioning that and doing that sort of digging that we need to do is a way that we can really get past this idea of these beasts. So I'm going to stop there and I'll stop sharing. And I would love to hear your questions or arguments against what I just said.
Feel free to unmute and ask questions.
Well, I don't have a question, but I just want to say thank you for debunking a lot of those things, because I certainly in my mind imagined that I was more of a right brain type of person. And I appreciate you, explaining those things and kind of getting rid of that old mentality. So it's very helpful. And I appreciate hearing this new information. So thank you.
Oh, you bet. And Patricia, I don't think we need to feel bad about, kind of buying into some of these, because maybe in your case, that idea of, well, I'm right-brained sort of acted as shorthand to you in terms of, these are what I consider my strengths, right? And it doesn't mean that, you can't do other things or whatever, but in some cases, we might use that terminology, like I said, just sort of like shorthand to acknowledge that maybe we prefer the kinds of activities that we typically call right brain, or maybe we think that's a particular strength of ours. And so, I don't want to, make it sound like, well, if you believe this stuff, you're quite a dope. And no, that's absolutely not the case at all. So, I think in many cases, like I said, this idea that, well, I prefer something, or I feel like I'm really good at a particular thing. And this is just a way to sort of explain that in a simple way.
Well, I have a question. So going back to the myth about the digital natives. So would you say then, or does research say, so, this generation that we myth have said are better with technology, would you say that it's true that they're maybe more accepting to the challenge of addressing new technologies in their lives versus the different generations, or is that a myth as well?
I'm sure that Mark Prensky and Don Tapscott would argue that, in fact, these digital natives would be more willing to sort of take a risk or to, kind of get out there beyond their comfort zone with technology. And I think that there is a percentage of, this group that will do that. But the research really doesn't confirm that. What we see again is that not only do people engage in, fairly basic technology skills, we use productivity software like Microsoft Word and PowerPoint and maybe Excel, although most people are not really good at Excel, but we use those productivity tools in fairly average ways. And that, in fact, what we haven't seen with the research is that we haven't been able to correlate, are you really good with technology? We haven't been able to correlate that with things like sort of more adventurousness or more curiosity, simply because there's such variability in terms of, even within a group that is like really good with video editing, right? We've got that percentage of people who are super good at that. But even within that group, there is such huge variability that we can't really then apply that that assumption of, well, that means that they're probably, more willing to like take the chance and learn something new and get out of their comfort zone. We really haven't seen those correlations.
I have a question about, there's a term thrown around a lot, like this particular group is tech savvy, for example. And I always stop and think about, well, wait a minute, does that mean you know how to use an iPhone? Does that actually mean that you can, or does that mean you can program programmable logic controllers? I mean, there's a wide spectrum of technological adeptness, if you will.
Right.
But when I hear that, I sort of wonder, or does that mean you use social media? So I don't know if it's ever been well defined, what is tech savvy. And also, I think there's a lot of I'm making this as a statement, but I think there's a lot of stereotypes. I'm a little bit older than all of you, and I've actually had people look at me at, like, if I'm at a store or something, and do you know how to text? I'll text this to you. And, I've actually had that happen because I have gray hair, and I don't, say anything sarcastic, but I just politely say, yes, I can text. And then I leave the store and roll my eyes like, okay, or whatever. But anyway, back to my original statement, tech savvy just has this wide net that, they cast, and it covers all of these different technological different areas.
Yeah, and that is such an excellent point. And, one thing that the research does show is that people who are called tech savvy are typically much more sort of task specific skilled. They might be really good at this one part of technology, at being able to do something like video editing or animation or game design or something. But that, in fact, what we don't see is that accompanying that, we don't see always this sort of ability to approach technology in a way that says, I understand conceptually what's going on. We see students relying on search engines so heavily, but do they know how search engines work? Do they understand why maybe I search on Google using a certain set of terms and you use those same terms and we get different results on, like, the front page? Why is that, right? Well, there are these algorithms behind search engines, and that conceptual idea of understanding that, maybe not understanding the algorithms themselves, but recognizing that, having that kind of conceptual understanding, we're not really seeing. When people say, oh, they're tech savvy, typically what that means is they can do they can do tasks. They might be procedurally talented, right? And so that's also an element of that. Are we including in that definition of somebody who's tech savvy that they sort of have that conceptual understanding? Are they able to approach a new piece of software and sort of figure it out? Do they have the problem solving ability to, like, dig into an application to identify, like, what can it do? What can it not do? These kinds of issues. And so I think you raise a really important point. What do we even mean by that? And I think we focus too much on sort of skills, right? As opposed to conceptual understanding about technology.
Maybe it's basically more to do with how well what is your aptitude for any kind of technology? What is your ability to learn any given technology that's thrown at you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's just such an important question. That rather than making this blanket assumption, that, oh my gosh, well, students, they know how to do X, Y, Z, that we get a little more specific about what it is we're looking for and the kinds of skills they need to do the tasks that we as instructors are putting before them.
Susan?
Yeah.
I have a question. As you're speaking, and I'm kind of going back to the skepticism discussion. And
yes, and you should be skeptical of everything I'm saying.
I kind of am now. I mean, I
Uh-huh.
kind of take everything with a grain of salt.
Good for
But,
you.
And I think, I tell people all the time, well, are you sure about that? Did you research it? What's the source? But, but I'm thinking about this. I'm thinking about how to apply this with my online courses.
Mhm.
And one of the areas that I'm thinking about is the courses I teach. The assignments are all written.
Mhm.
And so they have to do APA, and then they have to have sources, and of course they're supposed to be scholarly.
Right.
And I think I might be giving a little too much leeway on the scholarly part, because I do get sources that are just whack. And
Put it in scholarly terminology.
exactly,
Yes.
exactly, yes. And I think that this might be an area somehow where maybe I can provide some information or some feedback about sources, and then kind of model this skepticism, and and maybe talk some more about why you can't use Wikipedia as a source for your argument, or whatever you're saying.
Mhm.
So this whole skepticism thing really resonates with me, because of the whole thing about misinformation.
Right.
And
I think, yeah, we've definitely sort of had that thrust at us, that, oh my gosh, misinformation, when in the past, maybe that wasn't seen as a big deal.
right,
Mhm.
right, yeah. So that's given me an idea about,
Mhm.
because I'm trying to figure out how to apply this stuff.
Yeah, I think, again, promoting this idea of having students learn to evaluate sources is tough. And they need to learn how to do it somewhere, from someone, or somehow. But, whose job is that? Learning to, identify, credible information. Is it, does every teacher need to do that? Is that something we ask the library faculty to do? That's a tough question, but I think, again, the more we can hold students accountable for the sources that they're using, I think the better, and being able to, the students being able to explain, why do you think this is credible? What is it about that research, that makes you think it's probably, it's probably something I can believe. Um, that's a tough one. You know, I really like, if students are going to write a paper, I like to do that in two parts, that they do that first draft. And if I feel like, I think you need to go back here and look at these sources again, then I would sort of prompt them to say, well, be ready to tell me why you think I should believe this, or why you believe it. And really sort of holding them accountable for that, so that I have a chance to look for those weaknesses, and then sort of prompt them to go back and think about that for themselves and do some of that evaluation for themselves.
Right, right. I do that. I think I might just raise my bar a little bit more. But I constantly am challenging students on sources. It's become a thing where, it's like,
Right.
no, that's completely unacceptable. There's
Right.
no leeway there. And I do go
Mhm.
back to them and say, I kind of go through the scholarly source, and then I talk to them more specifically about that particular source.
Mhm.
So it's become a regular thing in my feedback.
Right. Yeah. It's yeah. And that's an excellent strategy. Is just, and Tom made this point in the chat saying, you know, uh, really sort of holding students accountable for that. You know, gosh, there's plenty of bad research out there. I just read a study that, oh my, I don't know how, it was a master's thesis. And honestly, I don't know how this person actually ended up getting their degree, but their research, they were asking, perceptions about a particular topic. And so what they did to collect those was they created this survey, and they just put the paper surveys in places around their town and asked people to like fill it out, and then just like there were drop boxes that they could put them in. So they like put them in grocery stores and they'd have a drop box and whatever. I mean, my first question was, okay, how many people filled out more than one of those, right?
Right.
I mean, and so we see so much of this research that maybe the idea behind it was good, but the actual execution was not. And I think those are things we need to help our students identify in terms of, should I really be believing this or not? So it's a combination of just being skeptical in general, as well as understanding what constitutes good research.
Right. Right.
Oh, Andrea, I love your explanation of when sources are whack. I love that.
Yeah, I acronymed your WAC statement, Jerry, spelled
Yeah.
WAC, W-A-C, and said, "We are concerned." You went on your WAC sources now.
This is totally whack. I'm going to use that from now on. Oh, that's great. I love it.
Thank you.
Other questions, comments, arguments? Well, I hope these ideas have been helpful for you. What I didn't want to do was come in and go, oh my gosh, look at all these myths. Who could believe this? But to identify those and then also say, what are just a few things that maybe we can do, to combat this? And helping our students learn to be more skeptical. And I always have to explain that when I say I want people to be skeptical, I don't mean that I want them to be negative about everything. I just want them to think critically about stuff and in fact, to protect themselves in a way, because being skeptical helps protect us from being fooled. And like I said, I think, many times, I can ask people, tell me what you believe in, right? And I'll know how to fool you. And so we need to protect ourselves against that. And, like I said, the last 5 years or so, that's become more and more obvious as we've seen the kinds of things that are going on behind the scenes at Facebook, for example. Let's see, Ruth, just today, Diane DeWitt shared a veterinary article about post-op care as a supporting argument for a student's class project in nursing. Oh, I like that.
I have to say I was appalled. I'm like, oh my word. But the other thing, it did in the article say nursing management of patients. And then upon further investigation, it is dogs and cats.
Hey.
Oh my.
Hey, oh, this patient has a broken leg, we need to shoot them.
Actually, veterinary medicine is trying to take our term and make it what do they call it? A nurse vet tech. There's been a big fight by nurses at the national level to nix that idea. Yeah, they want that term.
Oh, that's
Isn't that
interesting.
crazy? Yeah, so that's probably where that came from.
Yeah.
Well, it made for a good laugh, but then it also was like, oh my word. So of course, I quickly responded to her, sent her an email and show, to demonstrate the error of her ways.
Yeah. Yeah. And granted, some systems are similar, animals have a circulatory system, they have a nervous system, etc. But yeah, I think it would be very interesting to hear from that student why they felt that was a suitable source. Yeah.
Right. And I am looking forward to hearing back from her and to see what her response is. We will see. Stay tuned for further development.
That's right. Yeah. Yes, exactly.
I do want to note to the group that I did put a survey in the chat for everybody. So if you don't see that, please send me an email and I'll get that out to you.
Or, you don't have to do that, and I'll just fill out several of them.
Well, I could just send you some paper copies and have you fill out.
Right. I'll just fill them all out myself.
Yeah, that seems pretty legitimate. It could be whack, but we'll call it legitimate for now.
Okay. All right. All right.
So,
Any
there
other questions?
questions? Yes. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Susan. We will be back at 4. So if you guys want to come back with any questions and listen again, bring your arguments back.
That's right.
To the 4 o'clock session. I'm sure she would welcome them.
Yes.
But thank you all so much for joining us today. This was wonderful. I learned some things. I'm going to go find some sources and give them some questions here soon.
There we go. There we go.
Thank you. And we appreciate everybody for coming.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Appreciated the questions.